Right, I think we'll make a start. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm David Pringle, the moderator for today's webinar. This is an online workshop, which is a product of Science Business's Data Rules group, which is run by a steering committee representing leading companies and academic institutions, as well as the OECD. So this webinar is going to explore the rise of real-time data and the implications for artificial intelligence, R&D, and innovation in particular. So first of all, let's establish what we mean by real-time data. So, I mean, the term can be used to refer to any data that's just sort of milliseconds old, so very immediate. But in the context of the discussions of this webinar, we're going to focus on data that's only valuable for a short period of time, i.e. data that's got a short shelf life, as it were. So that period of time would actually be determined by the use case, which might include tracking atmospheric conditions, air quality, the spread of an infectious disease, for example, maybe traffic levels, the number of people in a shopping mall, or even a potential customer's body language. So there's all kinds of real-time data, which can quickly lose its value as time progresses. Now, our premise here is that as the cost of connectivity and computing power comes down, the volume of this kind of data is surging, and it's becoming increasingly feasible for organizations and individuals to continually monitor their assets, their performance, their health in near real time, creating what's known as digital twins, i.e. digital models of themselves, their environment, their assets, their equipment. So we're seeing organizations increasingly using cellular networks, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and other technologies to capture data from sensors and monitors attached to a wide range of machinery and equipment. And at the same time, consumer smartphones are capable of capturing a very diverse set of behavioral data. We've got the rollout of 5G, supplemented by edge computing and even low orbit satellites, and they're further increasing the supply of real-time data. And indeed, the deployment of data centers at the edge of networks opens up the prospect of AI systems acting on fresh data almost instantaneously. So this idea that there's very low latency and highly responsive systems. Of course, a continuous flow of real-time data presents both opportunities and risks. In particular, fresh up-to-date information should allow for AI systems to make better informed decisions. That's the upside. But the downside is it also reduces the window available for checks and balances. So in this webinar, we're going to explore this topic in two segments with lead speakers in each segment, and we'll leave some time for audience Q&A as well. So members of the Data Rules Steering Committee can ask questions directly, but other participants, if you could please post any questions you have through the chat function. This webinar is being recorded and is very much on the record. The recording will be published after the event together with an article summarizing some of the main takeaways from the discussions. So if I could ask you just to please mute unless you are speaking. I think most of you have done that anyway. I'm going to begin by asking the lead speakers to make a few opening remarks, just 3 to 4 minutes, to introduce themselves and how their work relates to this field. And then following the opening remarks, we'll have a panel discussion. And as I say, we'll also carve out some time for Q&A. So in the first segment, we've got a strong lineup of speakers. We've got Ran Korber. He's the co-founder and CEO of Borisometer. We've got Guy Liberali. He's the professor of digital marketing at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And Chris Atherton, who is a senior research engagement officer at Geond. So thank you to all of them for joining us today. We're going to begin by hearing from Ran, then from Guy, and then from Chris. So Ran, I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you so much. If you don't mind, I will share my screen to introduce myself and also introduce Borisometer. Just 1 second. Okay. So, my name is Ran Korber, and I am an environmental engineer, graduated from the Technion, which is like the Israeli MIT. I have about 15 years of practical engineering and management experience. I am also the CEO and co-founder of Borisometer, which is the leading environmental intelligence platform. In a world where health and climate are top of mind for individuals, businesses, and governments, what we believe at Borisometer is that every consumer experience, every product, and every business process must become climate aware and climate resilient. And with that in mind, we have set our mission at Borisometer, which is to improve the health and safety of billions of people worldwide by reducing their exposure to environmental hazards, such as air pollution, pollen, and wildfires, which unfortunately become more hazardous due to climate change. We do this by providing the most accurate environmental intelligence, which include forecasts on those environmental hazards, together with health insights, what people, individuals should do. This is available via multiple APIs and also consumer apps. For example, the web app and the mobile app you can see in this slide. Among our enterprise customers who use our API are leading brands such as L'Oreal, Dyson, and Volvo. Under the hood, to provide the most accurate environmental forecast, each hour Borisometer platform factors information from over 10 million datasets, which include sensors data, real-time traffic data, and much more. We develop sophisticated environmental models to use these datasets, and our unique approach merge different models to take into account various sources of potential pollution and climate risk. Altogether, we have developed over 40 unique proprietary algorithms, which include AI algorithms and dispersion modeling, which allow us to forecast over 30 different pollutants, covering in 100 countries at an astonishing resolution of up to 16 feet or 5 meters. And what we are very proud at Borisometer is that from last year, the Apple Weather app, which comes pre-installed in every iPhone, provide air quality data by Borisometer to hundreds of millions of Apple users in several countries, including the US, India, UK, France, Germany, France, and other countries. The data is reported in real time and reflect the user local air quality index and related health category represented visually, as you can see in those heat maps, within the local air quality index color scale. So this is me and Borisometer, and I will stop share.
Great, thanks, Ran. I'm going to drill down on a little bit of that later, but that's a great introduction to what you do and how it's making a difference. Let's turn to Guy now and hear from him. Guy, the floor is yours.
Hello, Sarah, can you share the screen, please? There we go. Thank you very much. Well, thanks, Dave, for the invitation to join this discussion and conversation on real-time data. My name is Guy Liberali. I'm a professor of digital marketing at RSM, Rotterdam School of Management, here at Erasmus. And I also worked with, founded 2 labs related with analytics and machine learning. And next to that, I also have a visiting position at Erasmus Medical Center, where we're using statistics to do adaptive trials, medical trials. Basically, my background is mixed. I have a PhD in marketing management science and a bachelor degree in computer science. And I did some postdoc, some years of postdoc at MIT. My research area and what I do for a living, let's say, is I apply Bayesian statistics and optimization methods to any real-time experiment that you can imagine, going from online advertising to website optimization or to clinical trials. And so that's the general framework. I only have 2 slides to show here. One coming up is going to be about I want to highlight a little bit the increasing importance of real-time data for machine learning. So we can imagine 3 moments. You can imagine description, descriptive analytics, predictive, and prescriptive. Think about descriptive analytics as a bunch of regressions, like you've been seeing for the last 50 years, where you have, you're trying, for example, to understand the relationship between wages, inflation, and education. And then you have all these numbers and estimates, and you're trying to look at the past data to understand what happened in the world in the last 5 years or 5 days or 5 hours. But that's telling a story about what happened. And the second level, let's say, can be prediction. Given those estimates, can we make a prediction about what's going to happen if we were to, let's say, increase the minimum wage? If what's going to happen tomorrow with pollution and so on. So that's the prediction part. But the third level, I think that's becoming more and more interesting, and that's where real-time data becomes really important, is the prescription part, where the machine is acting. So it's making decisions, it's prescribing things to be done, given the real-time sensors and data that's coming. So the reason I'm putting these three things here is because not only they are succeeding each other in terms of time, but the real-time data becomes more and more important, in my view, as we go closer to the action. My last slide, the next one, please. It's I want to highlight my view of machine learning. So I think you make the most, you get the most bang from your buck, or you get the most from the potential from machine learning when you put the machine to learn for you. So it's not you sitting behind the computer with the data and SPSS, e-views or Stata or whatever, running your regressions. So that's just fine. But you get more from machine learning and AI when you put the machine as an agent who's working for you. And that builds on a prediction, or that's the first box there. And then based on that prediction and a specific microsecond, a specific moment in time, an action is made. Let's say a drone is flying, it detects patterns in the weather and makes an action to go through this route. And then it observes successes or failures. It learns from that, and the next prediction, the next action is better. You can also think about recommendation system. Amazon makes a recommendation based on some prediction. There is an action, and Amazon observes success or failure, and it learns from it. Next prediction is going to be better. So I want to set this slide here as a background for some of the discussions that I think might come up later today. That's all I had. Back to you, Dave.
Right, thanks, Guy. That's really good context for our coming panel discussions. Appreciate that. Chris, let's turn to you. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, David. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Atherton. I'm a Senior Research Engagement Officer at Géant. For those who don't know who Géant are, we are the Pan-European Research and Education Network. I think really, if you take the history of the organization back to its beginnings, we were one of the first, well, the first internet, if you will, that shared data from CERN to national compute centers and research facilities across Europe, but also over to the US as well. And the World Wide Web first started off on our network. We've come a long way since then. So we've got two offices, one in Cambridge and the headquarters here in Amsterdam, where I'm joining you from today. And yeah, we offer a range of services, mainly to the research and education community, but also to pan-European research and education type organizations like the European Space Agency and ESA, and that's where I come in. So my role is effectively an account manager, business development type role, and I look after ESA, EUMETSAT, and most of the other Earth observation type organizations that Géant supports. I've got 15 years of experience in the IT industry and notionally in the space industry as well. And for the last 4.5 years, I've been working at Géant, been focusing exclusively on the Copernicus project and, as I said, anything to do with Earth observation. So I helped establish the link from the Copernicus data center to the Research and Education Network, and that helps to distribute all of the Copernicus data from ESA globally. About 80% of all of Copernicus data goes to research and education users. So that could be universities, research laboratories, national institutes, and everything in between. I also work closely, as I said, with EUMETSAT. Géant distributes the near real-time weather data from EUMETSAT to national meteorological agencies. That's called EUMETCAST, and we offer a particular service called EUMETCAST Terrestrial, which is only available via the RNE networks, or mainly available via the RNE networks. And yeah, I helped set up a number of these connections to Met agencies all over the world, including South Africa, Kenya, the regional mapping center there, and to NOAA and JPL in the US. We also work with EUMETSAT to connect the ground stations as well as ESA. and other operations centers around the world. So I can help get the data from satellites to the grounds, or from the grounds stations where they receive the data from the satellites. That gets transported to processing and archiving centers before it's then distributed to the wider public. So yeah, for me, real-time data is really interesting, especially in the context of AI. As I said, from the satellites across the ground network to the actual users themselves and how they integrate that into their workflows. And I'm keen to learn from the other speakers as well as contribute to the general discussion. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Chris. Right, let's go back to Ran. Actually, I want to start by just understanding how easy or how hard it is to get real-time data. Your sources of data. Presumably, you've got access to data now that you wouldn't have had access to 10 years ago. So just briefly, tell us a little bit about your sources.
Yeah, sure. So maybe we'll start with a short story. So the idea for mapping environmental hazards started way back in 2012. Already then there were a lot of data. Now it's in tens and 100x more available. But already then, as an environmental engineer, I knew that air pollution is the leading environmental cause for premature death and also dominant cause for many other respiratory diseases. And when I was looking for a house to buy with my wife, we decided that we should take into account air pollution. Again, this is 2012. And as an environmental engineer, I knew that the Ministry of Environmental Protection in Israel, the Israeli EPA and other authorities collect real-time measurements of air pollution data via sensors. And we reach out to them with a very simple question: where is the cleanest place to live in Israel in terms of air pollution? And although they had those gigabytes and terabytes of information of measurements via sensors, which is very accurate measurements, nobody could really understand and explain to me where I should buy the house, because it's raw data measurements. And if we look today, for example, and now we are in 2021, and there is more awareness about air pollution. If we look at the US, for example, according to the US EPA, about 120 million Americans lives in areas when the US EPA doesn't have any measurements about several pollutants. So a third of the US population lives in an area in which the US EPA is not aware what they are breathing. So on the one hand, there is a lot of data, and more data is coming via the web. This is thanks to the freedom of information, the Freedom of Information Law, and also the Clean Air Act, which was legislated in almost every country, and of course Western countries. On the other hand, it's not necessarily the data that you were looking for. So what we have done at Borisometer, we, as an environmental engineers, as scientists, and we are very privileged to work with top researchers from NOAA and NASA that joined Borisometer, as well as for the great research institute that we have here in Israel. What we understand is that there are many factors that impact air pollution. There are many factors that impact wildfires and pollen and other environmental hazards. And we are targeting to collect data about those real-time measurements, which are not necessarily environmental factors, but we can use those data sets in order to forecast air pollution. And I will give you just a short example. For example, we all understand that in major cities, traffic is a major source of air pollution. So by collecting real-time measurements of traffic jams in major cities, from London to New York to Boston, we develop those machine learning algorithms that can use this real-time traffic data in order to forecast what is the impact of the traffic on air pollution. And using that, we are able to show and forecast air pollution levels in major cities, even far away from any sensors that measure air pollution directly.
Right, thanks, Rand. No, that's really interesting. And yeah, it illustrates the point of, I think, thinking creatively about your data sources as well. So no, thank you. I'm going to turn to Guy now and just talk a little bit about maybe some of the obstacles this world faces. I mean, we obviously live in an increasingly real-time digital economy, but is data flowing freely, or are there obstacles and challenges that you would highlight?
So I think there are two ways, the two sides of the story, right? One is the ability of collecting this information with sensors, like Ron was saying, so we can better have a view of locations and what's happening. But we also can do the same in terms of opinions, what people are thinking and saying. And then that goes both ways, not just observing, monitoring what people are thinking, but you're also affecting what they're thinking. So I think one obstacle is, where do we draw the line and how do we handle this? How do we know when is okay? Should we just let people say what they want or not? So that's one obstacle, I think. Another one is sometimes it's more of a challenge than an obstacle. Sometimes this real-time data changes the roles or break down industries. For example, newspapers. And now breaking news is not something that is only exclusively by the big newspapers with tons of correspondents across the world. I mean, people are just uploading their videos maybe faster than the newspapers have access to that information. So I think some of the obstacles is, how can we respond and adapt to these changes in industry and changes how the world operates. So that's one. I'm just going to throw another one that maybe you can see how to connect us, how to organize discussion. But there's another one, which is who should guard the user, who should be the guardian of user level data. Because as you collect more information, most or some of this information is at the user level, individual level. So you know exactly what person is doing what and where. Some say that the safest policy to make sure there are no airplane accidents is to keep all airplanes on the ground. So yeah, nobody will ever crash if you keep the airplanes on the ground. Here's the same thing, right? Complete privacy. So let's just not share any information. So how do we manage this all? So there are three things that I think are obstacles or challenges that we should be somehow managing.
Thanks, Guy. Just before I go to Chris, I just want to touch on something you said there as a related point, I think, which is just, if people know that they're being observed and their behavior is being sort of monitored, let's say in a digital marketing context or something like that, is there a danger then that they change their behavior and somehow try to game the system? In other words, there's people, when they know they're being observed, they behave differently. It's a bit like how they answer surveys, etc. So you come in this kind of almost circle of people trying to second guess each other. Is that a risk?
Absolutely. For example, I know a lot of people who actually go to buy airplane tickets. When they do that, they actually go incognito mode, or they open 3 browsers to manipulate what firms are offering to them and to get the better perception. So it's not even about content, but also when you're going to get the best deals, right?
Yeah, so essentially, we're not necessarily always getting a 100% true picture from real-time data because it may be being manipulated in some way.
Physically manipulated.
Chris, I wanted to talk to you about actually raw data versus processed and filtered data in some way. Now, clearly, if you could just throw raw data at your constituents, your stakeholders, your customers, as it were, and let them get on with it. But presumably, in the real world, you can't really do that.
That's true. I mean, we don't do the processing ourselves. We deliver the data. However, you are right, with especially with satellite data, there's various levels of processing that would need to be achieved. So if you imagine level 0 is completely unprocessed instrument data, you've got level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. Each of the levels add an additional level of processing on top. So correcting for the atmosphere, correcting for the fact that the picture, if you will, has been taken from a particular angle, so that each image is consistent. Because that's the thing with AI especially, you want to make sure that the data that you have is consistent, replicable, and also valid. And this is one of the other levels of data processing that happens, is that the data that's acquired from a satellite, for example, is validated against ground-based sources, so in situ data, to make sure that it is actually giving you a reliable reading, and that clean data, once it's produced, is then very useful for end users. Once it's processed, though, end users themselves will still process it. A great example there was from Ran from his first slide, where he showed the data that was coming from different sources. When you mix them together, that's potentially, although you may argue with me, Ran, level 4 kind of data. It's processed modeled data that's mixed together. So it's like the ingredients of a cake. And yeah, the level 4 processed data is the sweet spot, if you will. At that point, that's where the data can have its real value extracted from it. And also, that's where, although near real time is very useful, keeping that data for future use can also be very useful as well. And one of the challenges I see is this data is generated, it's put online, it's used for only a short period of time, but the long-term benefit is derived from accessing that data repeatedly, reusing it again and again and again to get the most value out of it. And that's still a challenge, how we integrate those data sets into the research data lifecycle in order for data to be truly fair. So, yeah.
No, thanks, Chris. I'm just going to stay with you for a second, actually, because I just want to get a handle on if you do this sort of processing and combining of data that you're talking about, to what extent does that slow down the flow of data? Does it? I mean, is it still real-time data if you've done that kind of processing on it?
It depends. So when you say near real time, it's not in exact real time. It's within a few hours or a few days in some cases. It also depends on the type of equipment that you use. So take satellites, for example. You've got satellites in different orbits. Some of them are geostationary. They can send back a macro picture of the world because they're so far out, and the satellites move at the same time as the Earth spins. So they can transmit the data down to the ground, and it can be processed very rapidly. However, if you've got satellites that are closer to the Earth, they typically have higher resolutions. They spin around the Earth once every 90 minutes. But within that 90-minute window, they may drop the data down to a ground station only once. And then that data then goes into a processing chain where they take it, they process the data, they go through the various different processing levels before it's then published. And that can sometimes take a day or so for it to be published.
Got it. No, thanks, Chris. So turning to you, Ran, I think in your world, you'll need real-time data within maybe seconds or minutes. Is that how you think about it?
Yeah, definitely. So air pollution is extremely dynamic because it's been impacted by weather and climate, as well as by human activity. So we all impact air pollution, the cars we drive, where we go, what we do, all impact air pollution. And we literally see, for example, using our platform in the first COVID lockdown way back in March or April 2020, we literally saw which cities enforced lockdown and which city didn't enforce lockdown because of all the traffic and the air pollution the traffic emitted. And so it's important for us. And going back to Chris, we are big fans of the Copernicus project. We are one of the first companies to ever use several models and data layers from Copernicus. And what we have done, we have used machine learning algorithms or other dispersion models to take the near real time and convert it into real time. And this is also important when I pitch Borisometer and I mention we forecast air pollution. We do forecast for the next hour, 2 hours, until the next days, and for several pollutants, even weeks. But we also forecast for the real time, taking into account those other layers. And it's what we see is real-time have different implications. It's based on which application you will eventually use. So in our words, for example, for asthma patients, to be exposed to air pollution levels, real time is truly real time because they can have an asthma exacerbation within minutes of exposure or within 1 hour of exposure. But for people that want to purchase a house in the cleanest place, like I did, so they actually need those long-term measurements, and therefore they will want the last 1 month, the last 2 months, and then we are able to change the application in this regard. So it's depend on applications. I live in Israel. We have Iron Dome, so real time in Iron Dome. If you know, heard about it, this is maybe even milliseconds. So it's all depend on the applications.
Yeah, no, got it. Thanks, Ryan. I want to turn to Guy on one of the points that you raised there, actually, which is around the machine learning and this predictive element that I think Guy, you touched on as well. To what extent, I mean, machine learning is naturally inherently dynamic, but to what extent can you have human oversight of these systems if they are literally making predictions in real time? Can you have some checks and balances?
Yes, I think it definitely can and should. If you think, for example, social media, in which you also have a machine learning component, social media cannot be left unchecked because it can simply destroy economic and social and political structures in society, as we saw a little bit a few years ago. How can you do that? It's not necessarily the checks are real time, but you have some levers that can be used. Sinan Aral wrote this fascinating book called The Hype Machine, in which he suggests there are 4 levers that you can use. Money, funding, what's the business model of these companies on social media? Algorithms, can you check the algorithms that generated data? So you're not looking at the content, but at the code. Social factors and norms that they use to auto-regulate, and laws, of course. So I don't think it's necessarily real-time checking, but the incentive that they have to filter content. Of course, in some settings, for example, online advertising, real time, it's extremely important. It's like milliseconds. It's like we were talking before. But in general, speaking very generally, in machine learning, remember the prediction, acting, and learning. A machine will learn depending what you tell it to learn. For example, if a car is self-driving and it turns right and hit a chicken and kills the chicken, is how good or bad that is depends on what were the rules of what is good and what is bad that were put in the system before the car started to run. So there's never, even though sometimes we might see the machine is doing autonomously things, but what is good and bad was given to the machine by a programmer. And so humans are never out of the picture, even if sometimes it's comfortable to say that there was no human involved. There always is. I think you're in mute.
Yeah. Sorry, Guy. On that point, is it a good idea, is it good practice to draw some kind of red lines around how much a machine learning system can evolve? I mean, if it's getting a constant supply of data and it's constantly, the algorithms are continually evolving, should there be some kind of system limiter or some system that prevents it going too far? Is that good practice?
Yes, I think there definitely needs to be, let's say, a panic button. If you have that in stock market, why not having social media? Why not having other applications? It's like a kill switch, absolutely. Also, even in online experiments, on Amazon, Facebook, and other companies, when they run these thousands and thousands of experiments per hour, you do have kill switches for that, absolutely.
Right, thank you. Chris, I just want to touch on AI with you as well. To what extent are the AI systems that you guys are using or applying, to what extent are they dynamic, and to what extent do you have some kind of human oversight?
Well, most of the AI, it's not, I wouldn't say it's AI per se, it's say software-defined networking. So if, for example, one of the routes goes down, we can automatically redirect traffic around the particular part of the network. If part of the network then becomes overloaded, we can redirect traffic away from the overloaded part to other areas. So it's not, I wouldn't call it artificial intelligence, because it's just a set of rules that we've applied as human beings to the network. However, there are things which I think could be improved on. So, for example, there's new technologies that are available for disseminating data, which take away a lot of the stresses of configuring like individual routers and things like that for end users. So you can use automatic multicast tunneling, which is a type of technology to disseminate data straight to a web browser, for example, and it's completely seamless to a user, or transparent even to a user. They'd seen none of that. But yeah, the AI in our field is we're only really just dipping our toe into the subject. What we see is the large flows of data go into the data stores, the different organizations that use this data to process the AI. They're increasing daily and exponentially. When I started, I think we were doing a few petabytes a day, and we're doing a terabyte a day at least now of data, even after during the pandemic. So yeah, this is just research data that's being used by researchers, and a lot of the applications, especially with Copernicus, are using AI tools. So things like putting the data into data cubes, for example, to make them readily accessible, that AI tools can then integrate with and interoperate with. So you can send queries to the data cube itself, rather than having to download the data directly to your own location to process it on your machine. So there's an evolution going on at the moment in the way that people work, and AI is, I think, driving a lot of that evolution.
Yeah. Okay, I got it. Thanks, Chris. Ran, just before we go to the audience questions, I just want to touch on AI with you, if I may, because you're obviously in a competitive environment. You're in the private sector, and to what extent is it important that your AI systems, your algorithms, evolve faster than those of your competitors? In other words, are you in are you under a competitive pressure to continually have better data, more real-time data, and thereby better AI?
Yeah. So, in the private sector and in the high-tech private sectors, things are moving very fast. Probably if you catch the news every day, there is a new unicorn and a new company. Also, what Borisometer is focusing on, we are in the intersection of health, climate, and digital, and those three verticals are very popular now, thankfully, and so things are moving very fast. And the way that we compete is, first of all, we put a lot of focus on R&D. Even now, when the company is we almost have 100 people in the company, the vast majority of people are either scientists or engineers. And what we also did at Borisometer, and which we are very proud of, we even have a science team which report directly to the chief scientist office. We have about 10 people that have PhDs in different verticals, from atmospheric science to machine learning to medical data research. And we also have many algorithmic engineers at the R&D. And the way that we are tackling this very competitive landscape is by always looking for the next data sets which can provide us the cutting edge, whether it's traffic data, people reports on wildfires, for example. So in order to project and alert about wildfires and how they impact air pollution and how they impact pollen, we take into account not only satellite images, but also people reports on wildfires from using our app or other services. And another way is that we are always trying to improve our algorithms and also to improve how those different algorithms and different models, and as I've shared, we don't only have this one black box model, we have about 40 different models. And we also have models of how those different models react to each other. So there are many ways that we can improve, by adding new data layers, by developing new models and merge those different models all together. Another thing worth sharing is that, unfortunately, because of climate change, there are new environmental hazards that merge almost every day, or become more hazardous every day. So you always need to adapt and develop forecast for those new environmental hazards, because otherwise you might even mislead the user. So think about if I will recommend the user to go outside because the air quality is good, but it's rainy and there is rain or storm, so it's not a good recommendation. So we need to also mix the different environmental factors all together to provide the most accurate recommendation.
Got it. Yeah, you've got a lot to think about there, Ran. Okay, I've got a little bit of time here for audience Q&A, which I think Fabrizio's raised his hand. So I'm going to give Fabrizio a chance to come in. I think we've also got a question from Adina from Microsoft as well. But Fabrizio, if we can hear from you first.
Yeah, sure. My one was a kind more philosophical question, so it might be a little bit off the target. And then if that's the case, well, bear with me. I mean, data, real-time data, of course, are used by any kind of AI system. And of course, the problem is, the quality of those data, which goes back to, everything we have been facing in science forever. I mean, it's the data curation. I mean, even the smartest system, if you put rubbish in, you will get rubbish out. So that is a fundamental and general problem. Now, when it comes to AI and to the widespread use of AI, well, if we talk about Copernicus data, air quality, etc., well, we're still in the domain, let's say, of kind of objective data, being produced by sensor, by electronics and so forth. But, AI system, they also use a lot of, let's say, more social, human generated data. And their performing data curation is, I think it requires really a change in the society. I mean, if you like, for many, many years, access to data was restricted to a minority of people who could read first, and also people who had, enough interest and the purchasing power to buy newspapers. Newspapers were read by a little minority. So if you like, there was, again, not to say that only the elite need to have access to the data, but now the network goes everywhere, internet goes everywhere. So information then comes and feed AI systems. If they're of social nature, I mean, it can be absolutely rubbish because people with very low level of self criticism, well, let's say critical skills, low education. I mean, I was reading, really with terror, a recent survey by the press, by a press organization that was in Northern Macedonia. And there, it was connected to COVID and the perception of normal people about the COVID-19 pandemics. And a large majority of people, over 40%, thinks that the virus has been produced in a laboratory and they are being spread around the world by planes, so that they force the people to get vaccinated, and by vaccinating the people, they take control over. 40%, probably due at the very low level of, well, first of all, historical misfeeling with the many governments they had, so that we can't even understand, but also essentially due to the very low level of education. So I have this kind of general philosophical question that probably for social data we just need to wait until
I mean, you're making a good point, and thank you for that. I'm just going to get Guy to comment perhaps quickly on that because I mean, it is true that let's say there is an uneven picture out there when it comes to understanding of data.
Yeah. So I think if there was just a guy in the market in the 1800s saying misinformation, he was just babbling stuff. There was, right, people that were doing that, screaming nonsense, and people are still doing it. Well, I think what changed is that now they have powerful channels, social media. So I don't think the problem is the human doing that, because humans are humans. I think the problem is the channel, and the channel is driven by the funding, the money, by the algorithms, by the laws, and by the norms, as that the book I was talking about. So I think that's what we should work on, and say what is regulating those channels and acting on them.
Yeah, in the second segment, we're going to get a little bit more into the regulatory side of things. So let's discuss that further then. But I'm going to move to the second segment in a minute. But just quick question for Ran, actually, because it's come up in the Q&A. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, but I'll read it quickly. The Commission plans to update the laws around, that's the European Commission, laws around product liability and AI, products and services in light of the new consultation that's now out. How meaningful are such changes for short-term measurements in the scenario that asthma sufferers go into a heavily polluted area which the AI fails to pick up? In other words, questions around liability and your services, etc., how you might be concerned about that. So quick answer on that.
I'm not familiar with the new change in legislation. Maybe I will just comment to also what Fabrizio said, and maybe that will give some highlights. We at Borisometer, we are also take into account what we call I Feel Icy. So we have those different models that try to make sure that we provide the most accurate forecast, and I explain what forecast means. Forecast is also forecasting to the real time, and we also take into account what people see. If they see smoke, if they see a lot of traffic, what they feel. Are they feeling it's pollen season? Are they feeling, some irritation in their eyes, or are they coughing? Are they having asthma exacerbation? And we are all trying to mix it up. So, and by doing that, you can get into the next level of accuracy. Maybe it's level 5, Chris. And that also allow us to learn from the wisdom of the crowd, because eventually this is the goal. Like, we want to use all those Earth observations to provide true impact to society.
Great, thanks, Ran. Sorry, I've got one quick more question to come in from Adina, I think, from Microsoft. Adina, just quickly squeeze this in before we go to the second.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Adina Braha from Microsoft, working on sustainability. So I have a question just building on a couple of points, and one that Chris made around the importance of collaboration and collaborative analysis of data, and the potential of repurposing data sharing in that space. And I'm also wondering, how do you see the main challenges or opportunities to provide better collaboration around data, and we're looking, we're seeing the value of that with the work that we're trying to do around the planetary computer as well at Microsoft, with scientists coming together and discovering much better insights by putting their data together. And I guess my second question is, is there a case to make for climate data as emergency data, like we think about data that is needed in the pandemic? Because obviously we are trying to find solutions to a climate emergency, and we need to accelerate that and make it as quick as possible. So is there a case for climate data to be considered emergency data, so that we all accelerate progress in that space, and make sure that the collaborative analysis of these data sets are made more available and easier?
Thanks, Adina.
Thanks, David.
I think we're going to address some of those topics in the second segment, but I'll give, maybe Chris, do you want a quick?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for the question, Adina. I think for the second part, I totally agree with you. I think climate data should be classified as emergency data, because given the current situation that we're in long term, we do need to make a lot of changes in every element of society in order to tackle climate change. But going on to the first part of your question, I think one of the challenges is around integration of the various different tools that are used at each stage of the processing chain. Certainly for researchers, the tools themselves kind of already exist, but freestanding, or are freestanding, and don't fully integrate in the entire life cycle that researchers go through. That's something that we need to address in general, and also looking at the standards that underpin those different tools that are used, and to find a common way that we can all work together with these various different tools and sets. It also comes down to where the data is stored as well, and I know that there's the idea of the common data lake, where we can make all data from different thematic domains available for anyone to use. But that requires a lot of coordination, not just between the states that hold data, but also private enterprises that hold data as well. How would that data be published? How would it be exposed so that people could find it? How would the metadata be shared between all of the different parties involved? That's something that's not yet been tackled or really discussed in any great depth yet, and that's where I see that whole aspect of work going.
Thank you, Chris. I think we might have a speaker who can help with some of that coming up, actually. So we'll leave that over to him. Can I say thank you to the speakers in segment one? If they can stick around, obviously they might be around to answer some more Q&A towards the end of the webinar. If you can't, thank you very much for your insights and contributions. I'm now just going to quickly introduce the second segment, which is a more forward-looking segment, a little bit around the enablers, both regulatory and technical, that we might need going forward to really exploit real-time data and AI. So the speakers in this segment are Antonio Bison. He's the Legal and Policy Officer at the Data Policy and Innovation Unit of DG Connect at the European Commission. We also have Anjali Mazumdar. She's the theme lead on AI and Justice and Human Rights at the Turin Institute here in the UK. And Manolis Sava, he's an assistant professor at the School of Computing Science at the Simon Fraser University in Canada. So that's a very diverse and interesting group of speakers. I hope you'll agree. So again, I'm going to get each of them to introduce themselves a little bit further and frame the discussion for us before we get into more of a panel format. So if we can begin with Antonio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. And it's difficult to start a second panel after such an interesting first panel. So I just like to say that. I am a legal and policy officer at the Data Policy and Innovation Unit in DG Connect. I am speaking to you from Luxembourg. Prior to my current post, I was at the permanent representation of Portugal to the EU as a deputy attaché in the Telecommunications Working Party at the Council of the European Union. And there I helped with the implementation of the 6-month rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union. Now, I will just provide a bird's eye view of how we see data, and mostly from a legislative and regulatory perspective. And I will then leave colleagues to the more technical aspects, perhaps. So, as you well know, data creates value for the economy and for the society. Here at the Commission, we see it as a non-exhaustible economic good whose value comes essentially from the fact that it can be used and reused by a plethora of non-competing actors. And of course, real-time data adds another layer of potential good for society, for the economy. So we want to ensure that all actors, be it companies, research organizations, can use such data can use or reuse and manipulate it, combine it, correlate it in whatever way possible, in order to ensure that we determine how such data can lead to positive impact for society in general. For that, we adopted on the 19th of February of 2020 the European Data Strategy, which is essentially built on European values. And the aim of the European Data Strategy is to create a single market for data, where data is used in order to ensure Europe's global competitiveness, and it is used also for the common good. Now, one of the key pillars of the data strategy is that it is built around trust, around respect for privacy, and respect for data protection legislation, to ensure that flourish, to make this data economy flourish, we need to also ensure that data can flow across sectors and countries. Now, I will talk about just a few of the announcements made in this data strategy. First one would be the Data Governance Act, which you might know was actually the European Council and the European Parliament reached a political agreement on it just yesterday evening at around 10 p.m. And that is essentially the building block for the creation of the European Common Data Spaces. And then the second legislative action, which I would like to talk about, would be the Data Act, which is currently under preparation. And that will regulate who can have access to what data and under which conditions. So in order to ensure a fair data economy. And then the data strategy also announced the rollout of the European Common Data Spaces. So this is a new concept of federated data management, and this will increase the availability of data and the sharing of data between data holders and data reusers. So within this context of data spaces, the Commission doesn't really see a difference between normal data and real-time data. Real-time data essentially just represents a flow of data. So we want to create a system where there is a link between the data holder and the data reuser, so that the objectives that I mentioned before can be achieved. And this, although can only take place if there is a contractual basis that complies with the EU legal framework, including data protection. And so I think that summarizes essentially as much as possible in this short amount of time. And I would just like to, I'm just very much looking forward to the next speakers. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Antonio. I think we'll come back a little bit to how the common data spaces might work in practice. Maybe we could discuss that a little further, and particularly how they might facilitate a flow of real-time data. But let's first of all hear from Anjali. Let's turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the Science and Business group to inviting me to this webinar. So I guess as background, I'm Anjali Borisometer, and I am the theme lead on AI and Justice and Human Rights at the Alan Turing Institute, which David shared. For those who don't know, the Alan Turing Institute is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. And as its mission, it is a research institute whose mission is to make great leaps in data science and AI research to change the world for the better. And my particular role is really, and interest and focus is really on this intersection between AI and human rights. And I purposely say AI for human rights rather than AI and human rights, because we often talk about these as opposing polarized areas. So what I mean by AI for human rights is that on one hand, we're talking about how AI can be used for safeguarding human rights, actualizing the benefits, while mitigating against its potential risks and harms on particular areas. And of course, is how do we actually design this in a way that really does safeguard our human rights? And so that's really considering these questions and what our values and our norms are. So of course, privacy is one of those ones that comes up quite high on the totem pole there. And so then it's if there's both a social norm and a legal framework around that, what is the technical enabler on that? So for instance, we might be talking about consent on one practical matter, but on a technical instance, we could be considering privacy enhancing technologies, of which there's a wide range, of course, to consider and in what instances those could be beneficial. Other areas, of course, are around non-discrimination and other areas of equality to be considered, and what that means in particular contexts. And so I look at this very much from the perspective of our entities around data and data rights, or digital rights, to what we've called about responsible AI or algorithmic accountability, which gets into robustness, fairness, all of these areas, to also the infrastructure and the ecosystem, which gets into not just issues of access to some of the infrastructure in itself, but also the human interaction with these various systems, which touches on a few things that were raised earlier in terms of equality or inequality access, and that has some potential risks and harms to be considered in the design, development, and deployment of these technologies. And so how we shift again, I know here we're talking about real-time data, and of course it's the acceleration of that in real time and the considerations we should put into place. I think I'll leave it there. And
yeah, no, thanks, Anjali. I mean, there's a lot of big topics to get into there, actually, which we will come back to, some of those at least. I know that you looked at the context of how data and AI was used in the context of the pandemic, and maybe some of the lessons from that could be interesting in this context as well. But we can come back to some of that a little bit later. But let's first of all hear from Manolis.
Thank you, David, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I'll try to give a very brief self-introduction and also a description of the perspective from which I come. So my name is Manolis Sava. I am an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University in the School of Computing Science, and I'm a Canada Research Chair in Computer Graphics. My perspective is very much that of a computer scientist. So I care deeply about the computational and technological challenges. How can we create technology that helps people? I'm very happy to be participating in this panel because I would really like to hear also from experts in other areas that interact with these computational and technological challenges. My research is at the intersection of 3D computer graphics, computer vision, and artificial intelligence. And more specifically, I work on the analysis, organization, and generation of 3D content. In particular, computational simulations of interior spaces and how people can interact with those interior spaces in our everyday lives. More broadly, my research is aiming to endow artificial intelligence systems with a fairly holistic understanding of 3D scenes that surround us in our everyday lives, and enable us to develop computational systems that can assist us, for example, assistive robots, autonomous vehicles, intelligent personal assistants, and so forth. One of the main motivations for my work is to make it easier for everyone to create 3D content, or in other words, to democratize 3D content creation. Currently, creating high fidelity 3D representations of objects and spaces are surrounding us is something that requires a lot of expertise in using complex software tools and requires a lot of training, a lot of time investment. I envision that there can be a world where creating and personalizing and sharing 3D content that is meaningful to us will become as easy as just taking a photo with a smartphone and then sharing it with other people. So I'll leave it there. That hopefully gives a picture of my perspective and my background.
Thanks, Manolis. You've given me actually a good jumping off point to our first topic, which I wanted to talk about, was the democratization of this actually, and the fairness and how we ensure access to real-time data is equitable. I might start with you on this, Anjali, because I think one of the issues we face here is if some people have access to real-time data and they can analyze it quickly, they may have an unfair advantage in all kinds of walks of life over people that don't have access to that kind of data. And we've seen a lot of variable outcomes in the context of the pandemic, with some people better informed than others, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you think we ensure fairness in this space?
I think that's a really tough question of how to ensure fairness. And I think it comes down to a couple of things. One is initially, I think somebody earlier in the first half of this webinar raised issues around data quality. And so there's issues around that in terms of the quality of it and the bias that might be in there that constitutes some potential risk of bias and a risk of a lack of fairness. The other part is the access, as you sort of raised. And we often talk about, I think, some of these issues of equality in technologies and data in terms of global north, global south. But of course, we have these issues within borders, within a jurisdiction. And then we have communities or minoritized communities, often that not only don't necessarily have access, but could also be targeted in certain ways. And that's a concern that needs to be addressed. I don't think there's a quick fix to it. Antonio might have something else to add to that. So I'm always looking at the balance between where we want to, again, enable these data flows. We want to actualize these benefits, but what are both the legal and these technical areas where we can try to balance that out? And of course, we can consider that both the data and the algorithm that's developed could be fair. You could have a tool in which it's been determined it's robust, it's fair, but its use is another case. So COVID has been one area, the area of security or criminal justice in terms of facial recognition technology and how it might be used in real time in some situations could obviously create a situation in which we have a concern about that bias. So we need to consider that even though the technology may have been designed or developed, it's fairest, its use, let alone from the access side.
Yeah, no, thank you. You framed the problem further for us there, which is helpful, definitely. I'm going to turn to Antonio now, actually, because Antonio, how do you think about this democratization, this ensuring people have fairly equitable access to data tools, real-time data, etc.? How do you think about that? Is that shaping the common data spaces in any way?
I think yes, of course, because currently we have a situation where there are certain players that have greater resources to grab data compared to other, for example, SMEs that don't have the same resources to do so. So indeed, it's not an easy question, and the answer is even more difficult trying to determine how exactly to ensure fairness in the distribution of the value created by data. But I guess the common data spaces are a preliminary step in that direction. Now, so perhaps some of you might know, some might not, but there is often a common misconception regarding data spaces that I think could be worth clarifying. Data spaces did not imply that when you are an actor and you have been granted access to a data space, you have access to all of the data that is in that data space. You have essentially the best analogy right now would be saying that a data space is like a market. So if you want a specific product, I don't know if this is making a bit of noise, the airplane, apologies for that. But a data space is like a market. So if you want a specific product, you have to get in touch with the supplier of that product. Now, in that regard, the Data Governance Act actually created a new type of a novel actor in the market, or it didn't create it, it actually regulated it, because this type of actor already existed. It is the so-called data intermediaries. Now, this also addresses one of the questions that was raised in the previous panel by, I believe, Professor Guy Liberali, who should guard the user's data. The novel aspect that is brought forth by the Data Governance Act is that these data intermediaries are not allowed to use the data that they are holding on behalf of the data subjects, for instance, or the data holders. So they would have only they would create the link between the data holder and the data reuser. Now, that neutrality is what ensures difference between the European model of dealing with data sharing and other models around the world. So essentially, we want to create an ecosystem where the data can be shared in a more trustful manner, and that also, I guess, will lead to fair distribution of data as well, since the data holder and the person who is procuring the data will have indeed someone who is taking care of the curating of the relationships between the two actors. So in a very perhaps an analogy, it would be like entering into a restaurant and having the sommelier come up to you and providing you with a list of the wines that you would be perhaps interested in, and then you request and you would accept the wine, and that would be the link and the exchange of data that would take place then.
Yeah, no, got it. Thanks, Antonio. So, I mean, hopefully the net result, we can come back to this, but hopefully the net result is faster, easier data sharing as a result of that, and hopefully more equitable data sharing as a result. But let me just come back to Manolis, actually, because I think it'd be interesting to discuss our end goal here to a certain extent in terms of the individual and the vision of where you think this is all taking us. So if I'm an individual in future, do I get some kind of real-time data feed about my surroundings that tells me everything I need to know in real time about, am I safe? Do I have access to the services I need? Where do I need to go to do whatever next? You know, what kind of vision are we looking at here in terms of the real-time data flow around an individual?
Yeah, that's, I think, a very interesting question to think about. What will the future look like in terms of real-time, highly contextualized, high-fidelity data about our lives? And I do see a trend that we will have more and more information that captures our everyday context. It's nowadays not uncommon for smartphone devices to be able to sense in great detail our 3D context. The latest generation of iPhone and iPad devices is equipped with LiDAR sensors that can actually capture in great detail our surrounding environment and acquire representations of the spaces and objects that we interact with on a regular basis. And I believe that trend will continue. We will continue to get higher fidelity data on our surrounding context. It will become easier and easier to have that data, at least at the individual level, and it will become easier to share this data as well. I think where it becomes a little bit less clear is exactly what the outcome of that will look like, right? How will this data be then, accumulated or leveraged by particular organizations? There are many important questions around that about how should this be structured, right? What frameworks should we put in place to maximize the utility of all of this data that we will be able to collect to everyone and make this equitable, right? Make this safe, make this fair. These are unfortunately questions that I probably don't have a lot of background and experience to answer, but I do find them to be very important. And one thing that I will say from the perspective of a computer scientist is that I see that what will become increasingly important with this kind of ubiquitous data capturing our everyday lives is preserving also metadata that goes along with this data. Metadata that has a clear record of the creator, the source of the data, the transmitters, that pass the data along, and also the entities that are represented in the data, right? Entities, whether they are objects or people or spaces. So the importance of this kind of metadata, preserving it and passing it along with the data and having a clear kind of a provenance record for the data is going to be very increasing over time, is my belief.
Yeah, no, Manolis, so that'll be very important to build trust in it, actually. But yeah, I want to touch quickly on something you said, and I'll come to Anjali on this as well. But Manolis, first of all, is there a danger in the world that you're kind of moving towards? Is there a danger of some kind of data overload in the sense that the individual's inundated with lots of data about their surroundings and all sorts of information that they can't necessarily process? They then become over-reliant on AI systems or whatever it is. So do you worry about that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think there is a danger, especially if there's no ability to easily filter and understand where data is coming from, how who are the originators, how important is it to me, how much trust should I place in it? How much should I care about it? I do think there's a big danger, and we're seeing a lot of this happening right now with social networks, right? We don't have to have this futuristic version of high fidelity continuous streams of real-time 3D data. It's already happening with social networks nowadays. There are big dangers. I think it will take some very serious thinking about how to better structure the mechanisms and frameworks that we use to create and share data.
Great. And Johnny, can I just get you to comment on that as well? Because as I say, there is this risk of data overload for individuals in particular, I think. But what are your thoughts on how we mitigate that?
So I think it's a really important point. As a statistician by background, I also get excited by data, and there's an interest to sort of, if there's data available, let's bring it all together. But there's a question about whether or not we need all that data for whatever the question is, or whatever the prediction we're trying to make, the decision we're trying to make. Do we need all of it? So there's technical areas around, what is enough information in there? Do we need any more? What is sufficient information? And that would definitely probably also support in terms of safeguarding from a data rights perspective too, of not just overloading a system or a developer in it. Considering there could just be noise in some of that data as well when you just keep accumulating data and it's not giving you anything more. So I think there's the technical aspects of what we can consider. What is sufficient information? Do we really need more data? There's excitement in it, of course. There might be different types of data that could give us similar information that we don't really need. If we're talking about some censored, sensors on various instruments versus more administrative data. Do we need the combination? What combination gives us a more sufficient aspect? And this probably touches on issues around digital twins as well, of where we're creating a digital infrastructure of a system or process, and how much do we need that can tell us about a human's context. So I really think there's just we need to balance again this whole excitement around the data with how much is sufficient for its use.
Yeah, got it. No, that's a very interesting philosophical question, I think, which we probably don't have enough time to explore here. I do want to now just turn a little bit, before we come to the audience Q&A, to more practical kind of next steps. So I'm going to come back to you, Antonio, because the common data spaces are, now up and running, or beginning to get up and running, I guess. So I think I'm right in saying the health data space, maybe the climate data spaces are the most advanced. But can you just tell us what success looks like? I mean, maybe in a year or 2 years, what the common data spaces will have enabled that we don't have today?
It's a very interesting question. I guess at the end of the day, it's a little bit difficult to predict how innovation actually happens, because I think that's part of what innovation is. But at the end of the day, we want to ensure that the creation of the sectoral data spaces, so the data strategy announced 10, manufacturing, Green Deal, public administration, skills, and there's a few others, that success would mean that these data spaces will no longer be working kind of in their within and for their own sectors, but would be actually sharing data across the sectors. So the data would be formatted in such a way that it would be truly interoperable, for instance. So data that would be collected for instance, satellite purposes could also be used for the mobility sector, and as well as for the energy sector. So that, I think, would create and lead to a genuine single market for data, which will inevitably lead to innovation beyond our wildest dreams.
Got it. Thank you, Antonio. I'm going to turn to some audience questions here, because we've got a few quite meaty ones that I want to kind of squeeze in if we can. We might be able to come back to some of these topics, but One here is, how do we ensure that public universities and research organizations have fair access to the real data collected and stored and curated by private companies that they need for their research? So, I mean, this is a perennial question, but how do we actually get the private sector to share their data with researchers and academics? Now, Manolis, I'm going to ask you this because you are a researcher and academic, and presumably you would actually appreciate getting some data from some of the big internet companies, etc. Are there steps that the Canadian government or other governments could take to make sure you get the access to the data you need?
Yeah, I'll try to give a perspective. I'm not sure, how much of an accurate picture it will be, because it will be, a somewhat one-sided view.
Oh, yeah, no, unfortunately, we can't. Well, we do have a private sector on this webinar, but let's hear from you first.
Yeah. I think probably one of the most important steps to making this easier is to have a better way to connect entities in the private sector with researchers and academics who care intimately about a particular type of data and whose research could be of value to those entities. So if there's a way, I'm imagining something similar to the data spaces that are being described here, these markets, right? Where, there could be various organizations with particular types of data that might be useful for particular types of research, and then researchers whose topics of interest match with that data, and the outcomes of that research might be of benefit to the private organizations. I imagine that would be a kind of framework that could facilitate easier access to data and allow these kinds of synergistic relations to emerge much more efficiently than they do nowadays. So that's my perspective, and it's coming from this experience that it's often hard to know okay, who should I be talking to get this kind of data exactly, and and why should that person care, right? I don't really know exactly why they would care about the output of my research. So having this kind of marketplace that makes this information a little bit easier to access, I think would help quite a bit.
Yeah. Got it. Thanks, Manolis. I'm going to get Antonio just to comment very quickly on that, because what do you see as in the common data spaces, what do you see as the incentives for private sector companies to share data?
The incentives for private sector bodies to share data, I mean, it can be exactly from the notion that the value created by data is exponential, so to speak. It's because every time that someone else uses it, it doesn't lose its original value, right? It's still there. So every time that you would be participating in the data space by contributing with data, you would also be getting something out of it. So perhaps you would be accessing data that would be useful for your particular purposes, but it does not necessarily conflict with the interest of the person who provided such data. So it's very good to hear that the message is hitting home, Manolis. And indeed, the data spaces, I believe, it would be the perfect place for such exchange of data to happen. Now, the role of the data intermediary is exactly the one that would create and mediate the link between the person who is looking for the data and the person who is offering data. The person, obviously, I mean the entity. So and such data, suffice to say, can be provided for free if it's so wished by the private organization. For instance, let's say that they want to help foster development in a specific industry, and so they provide their data for free. But this data can also be against remuneration. So it really depends on the wishes of the person providing the data. And that can in itself be an incentive for certain organizations to participate in the data space.
Great, thanks, Antonio. And Johnny, I'm going to put the next question to you, actually. So this is, again, it's in the Q&A, but I'll just read it out. What do you think about the role of gatekeeper and curator for AI? In a data-saturated world, can AI identify both relevant and accurate data, i.e. filter the incoming data flow to items which are relevant to the specific user, as well as sufficiently accurate for the user's declared purposes? So in other words, you have some kind of AI assistant that actually curates your data for you. Is that a runner?
Well, there is already some work being done that wants to look at, can AI be, so where we've got AI as a technology, as a tool, can AI be used also to filter, to safeguard the data in some ways? But I think this is constantly using a technological tool or a band-aid on something, and we need to question whether or not it should be a technical tool. It's not always it shouldn't always necessarily be a technical response. So just because it can be done doesn't mean that it necessarily should be is one response, which may not be the one that people want to always hear. But I actually just want to touch on this point around the data intermediaries, because I think it's a really important one, and one that I work on, and others obviously globally, but at the Institute that we've been focused on too, is to really think about whether we're talking about data trust, data collaboratives, all these different forms. One is the legal mechanism that enables this, and then one is the technical kind of infrastructure as well that will enable this. And I think what's really important here is that we're having these legal mechanisms that can enable us to do this work, but is also to consider, do we really need to share the raw data, or what is the data, or in what form the data should be shared? And as researchers, we do face the challenge, of course, not just with the private sector, but is really looking at what are these incentives so that we don't have to constantly keep asking for the same data, but also recognizing that, again, depending on the context, if we're talking about health, we saw in the UK during the pandemic, and globally, of course, that depending on the infrastructure, hospitals weren't connected, various agencies within the health sector were not connected enough to be able to access and therefore support our government in their response in real time, or really even in less real time for that matter. And these are all, the more we can invest in these types of infrastructure, the more it will enhance both the innovation side and I think on a policy level as well.
Got it. We're running out of time, Anjali, but there is a very quick question I'm hoping you can also address. And then I've got a very quick question for Antonio. So we'll try and do these quickly. But what this question is, are there specific human rights concerns connected to real-time data that asynchronous data collection sharing do not have? So does real-time data raise a particular human rights question, I guess?
So I would say it, probably less so. I think it just heightens the human rights concerns that already exist in the sense of any issues around privacy or inequality, non-discrimination. All of those are simply heightened, and where we don't really have this necessarily a governing body that somebody can raise the issues of redress or concerns around. I think that's where we're getting to. And the more that actually data gets shared across sectors and globally, that becomes a growing challenge.
Because there's risks attached to that, I guess. Yeah, no, got it.
Yeah.
Antonio, just a very quick question for you. There's a question here. It's, I guess, really, will the common data spaces serve entities outside of Europe as well as within Europe, essentially? In other words, is this broad? Will everybody, regardless of where they are, have equal access to the data spaces?
So I think that's kind of like a multi-layered question, because the beginning implies one thing, but the other one is a little bit different. So will foreign entities be able to participate in common data spaces? And the short answer is yes, as long as they comply with the European rules and values, for instance, as well as the rules that have been established to organize that data space. So it's yes with an asterisk. And I think at the end of the day, it's something that is very clear to everyone, is that international data flows is something that is absolutely essential, considering that the data economy is not something that can be just closed off, and whatever comes out of one small circle of actors will never be as strong as something that indeed includes a vast or an open number of participants. So, and especially seeing from the perspective of Europe in that regard, European companies need that kind of flow, but they also, and this is we see across the board from all kind of entities, the fact that Europe places such importance to the preservation of security and privacy of the data is what makes our model unique, and that is our selling point. And that is also how what we believe, that by preserving such security and privacy of data, we are increasing trust and therefore increasing data sharing. So this is something that we are extremely attentive and vigilant in order to ensure that our rights, obligations, and interests are protected. And so we have been also working with international partners to ensure that the European model of data sharing is spread around the world, and essentially just promotes the number of opportunities that European companies, but also us as individuals can enjoy from this increased data sharing.
Got it. Thank you, Antonio. We are actually right up against the hour, so we're going to have to conclude there, unfortunately. I realize that there are some questions that we haven't answered, and I realize we've jumped from topic to topic, which is unfortunately inevitable, I think, with a big subject such as this. But a big thanks to our speakers for both the diversity of perspectives and the insights that they've shared. I think it's been very interesting, and there's a lot of themes that we could follow up as the data rules grew. So actually, there's a lot of material that we can build on here. So thank you for that. Do look out for the recording of this webinar and the summary article that I will write, which we'll publish as Science Business. But I'd like to thank both the audience and their speakers for their time and insights today. It's been a really good discussion. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. Bye.